Okay, so we have another rainy morning, um, and so good morning. So This is the video on the Plutarch reading, first reading, and this is this reading clearly is historical. It's a primary document. It was written, I can never remember exactly, sometime in the first century, what we used to call AD, the Common Era, whatever, like CE now, I think. It's hard to get my head around some of these new phraseologies. I'm just an old-fashioned guy. I'm an anachronism in many ways. Anyway, so I'll talk a little bit about Plutarch, why we pay attention to him, and then I'll get into the treatise. Really, is what it would normally be called. It's not really an essay. It's not an article. It's a treatise from the ancient world. So, and what's interesting about Plutarch, who is a Greek, but he's living in the Roman world. So he lives in Greece. He is an elder, if I remember this correctly from Wikipedia. You can check me. He's an elder, or not a priest per se, of the Oracle of Delphi. So he lives near Delphi. And of course, the Oracle of Delphi is famously the place, I'm sorry, I'm playing with my tea, is the place that people go to find out about their future. So this is the place famously that Oedipus went to, and in fact, his parents went as well to find out their futures. So this is Oedipus left. No, so Oedipus, so the parents, when they learned that their son would return to murder his father and marry his mother, they were aghast. This is not something the Greeks would have done, either of those. The Romans cared less about murder, I think. But the idea of marrying your mother would have appalled them. So they decided to put Oedipus out in a field and let him die of exposure. Along comes a shepherd, saves Oedipus, raises Oedipus as his own, and so he goes to the Oracle of Delphi, and he leaves home, learning that he would murder his father and marry his mother. And so on his route heading to Thebes, I think, he runs into a party, kills the leader, who happens to be his father, who was king of Thebes. Goes into Thebes, solves the riddle that rids Thebes of the Phoenix, who was terrorizing Thebes, and he marries the queen, who would be his mother. And Sophocles writes a play about it, which I read junior year in high school. So I'm on a tangent. Sorry about that. So Plutarch, anyway, is we listen to him in part because we have, as best we can tell, all of his works. One of the few ancients, if not the only ancient, that we have everything he would have written. Okay. So this piece he wrote on the education of children, also known as the Moralia. So I'm going to share my notes, which are not extensive. So here are my notes. So Plutarch, this piece historically, as we move from the ancient world into the medieval world and the resurgence of learning, of schools, and all tied to the learning of Latin. So Charlemagne could have a single language that all of his bureaucrats, his clerics, the monks that helped him run and recorded the empire would know. These schools were set up in the 8th century by Alcuin of York, who was a monk in the famous monastery of York, produced a number of different scholars. And so this is where schools are developed. Monasteries were always tied to learning to some degree, but this is where it really gets an official impetus, because we need knowledgeable people to run things, whether it's for a prince or a bishop or a king or the Holy Roman Emperor, which Charlemagne will become. So by the 10th century, you have the coalescence of a course of study known as the liberal arts, 7 liberal arts. And they are first 3, which is known as the trivium, from which we get the word trivial from. The first 3 are the art of grammar, the really Latin grammar, the art of Latin rhetoric, and the art of Latin dialectic. Dialectic is a fancy word, if you will, for the word logic. It's a Latin word for the word logic, which is, I believe, probably English, Anglo-Saxon. So this is a point in time where a young student, probably beginning at the age of 7 or 8, would go to a monastery or later a cathedral school, and would begin to learn their Latin first orally by learning prayers, how to recite prayers, and how to chant the beautiful Gregorian chants, and how to converse. Because at any given monastery or cathedral school, the priests, the monks would have been from across Europe. So their vernacular, their native language might have been French, might have been English, might have been German or some form, could be Spanish, even Portuguese, some form, French, came in several dialects, depending on what part of France you came from. Could have been, Scandinavian, could have been, depending on the German area of Germany, High German, Low German, High German being up the river, Low German being down the river, particularly talking about the Rhine. And could be Italian. Okay. So the languages of medieval Europe were very diverse. It could have been Polish as well as Baltic, Scandinavian, as I said. So even Polish would be Slavic, depending on what part of the Slav world you're from, whether you're a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. So you conversed in Latin, and you learned all that orally. You learned all that conversationally. And then after you knew a certain level of Latin orally, you would begin grammar school, learning the basics of the language, much as we do in English today. Then once you achieve that, you would then move to rhetoric, which is the art of disputing well. So it's active debate or discussion, speaking, oration, poetry would be, particularly among younger students, would have been a big thing. So, and they would have learned to write as they went with this, and to read. Okay. And then finally, the art of Latin logic or dialectic, how the language is put together. Okay. How ideas are conveyed, the structure, how to analyze a text would be part of that as well. Much like the marking text activities you may teach your students. And once you achieved Latin learning, once you achieved the trivium, you then got your bachelor's degree. And all that really refers to is that, because in the medieval world, once you became a bachelor, then for the most part, you were committed to not marrying and working as some type of religious cleric, whether monk or canon or priest or something along the way. But this also, and you would teach, okay, because you had to teach the trivium once you got your bachelor's. So think of grammar school as adolescents, 15, 16-year-olds. This is about when you would get your bachelor's. Teaching, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. So teaching late grammar or middle school students. So that, think about how that might have worked. And then, you would have some that would be older, obviously, as time went on, as things became more specialized. But while you taught, you also took the second part of the liberal arts, which was called the quadrivium, meaning 4, which would be music, math, geometry, and astronomy or physics. It's really about the motion of things, the motion of the planets, but motion, so a lot of basic science. You would get some biology in that as well, using probably early on the works of Aristotle and maybe some Roman scholars on that. Plutarch, probably part of that, just depending on what was available. In time, you would have had, medieval, the later medieval folks would have had writings of earlier medieval scholars on these areas, to also treatises, so to learn from, okay, and to analyze. And basically what you had to know Latin because everything was in Latin. So anything you read, and so basically you had to research treatises, a lot of textual research, and compose your own writing, and also be able to speak about these things. So rhetoric would have been important. You probably had very little handwritten notes. You learned the art of memory, so you could dissertate, dispute, orate on these ideas with other scholars, and to teach it. Okay, so this is an early form of of curriculum before curriculum existed, because curriculum, as you read in the next reading, curriculum as we understand it doesn't exist yet in the medieval world. It comes at the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance. That gives you a little bit of history of learning. The 7 liberal arts, and basically universities begin to arise in the 12th century, and they are a collection of schools. So where any place, like the most famous, of course, in the medieval world is the University of Paris. So in Paris, you had some cathedral schools, church schools, and monastery schools. Okay, and they came together and created corporations of schools, which became universities. So that's all a university begins as kinds of guilds of scholars. Okay, so a corporation here is a corporation for a guild, for a set of scholars, just like you could have a corporation for tradesmen, cobblers or bakers or candlestick makers, butchers. These, same type of thing. The same language of bachelor, kind of still fits into those areas. Although in the trades, you only remain a bachelor until you you finish your apprenticeship, and then once you're able to open a shop, then you're able to marry, right? So we had economic restrictions on marriage, even within the peasant class. And so you had again, you have this highly stratified society. We all kind of know about that. Serfs at the bottom, really slaves at the bottom. Slavery was, it was hard to tell the difference between serfs and slaves, but slavery was very much part of the medieval world. So, as adopted from the ancient, and there were rules. You cannot make another Christian a slave. So it would have to be a pagan or a Muslim. And the Muslims had similar rules. You weren't supposed to make Christians or Jews slaves in the Muslim world or Muslim, because they were all people of the Quran. They were kindred religious. At some point in the history of the world, as you begin to run out of pagans, everyone's either have become Islamic or they become Christians, well, then when then we sort of redefine the infidel, because the infidel referred to a pagan. We redefine, the Islamic world redefined who the infidel was, and so Christians would then be enslaved, particularly by, probably the 15th, and I'm not sure much earlier than that. Anyway, little asides as I get into the history. Okay, so Plutarch writes on the education of children. What is this? Okay, this is a book or a treatise, I should say, of who your two parents, I would say, today. Really, he's speaking to fathers in his day, because in the Roman world, men were everything. Women would have been considered second-class citizens. But obviously, women played an important role in the household. But you see, the early part of the treatise is basically Plutarch talking about prohibitions, what you shouldn't do as a man, what you shouldn't do as a father, beginning with watch who you sleep with. Don't get drunk. Don't sleep with drunks, because you're probably drunk. Don't sleep with prostitutes or women of ill fame. Because in the Roman world, if you fathered a child, you became responsible for that child. Now, we do know that the Roman world practiced infanticide a great deal. But this was still, and obviously the Greek world did too. That's the story of Oedipus. So this is the prohibition on men and fathers. He wants you to beware, advice we would be familiar with today. Watch who your children hang out with. Okay, don't let them run with a rough crowd. Don't let them use foul language. We find it's interesting here, biblically, we think of parenthood as spare the rod and spoil the child. It's clear Plutarch is not all that pleased with corporal punishment. He warns against it. Clearly, at times it might have been necessary. He wants fathers not to speak to his children roughly, to be pleasant, to show love. And I would extrapolate, if you show love to your children, you're probably showing love to your wife. Okay. Particularly coming in from both the Greek and Roman world, marriage was seen as important. We hear all the stories in the empire period of Rome of all the sexual escapades and orgies and all these things. By and large, this is for the upper class and not for the everyday folk. Okay, middle class Romans, working class Romans would not have been part of this. Also, in terms of the slaves, I would suggest that for most slaves, family would have been very important, because for the slave owner, family keeps people happy, and they will remain productive. Okay. He even warns, Plutarch here, you might find interesting when you read, as you've read, he warns against who your wet nurse is. There was a time probably where, in my day, we would not have really understood, everyday folks, what a wet nurse is. currently, I think, particularly in the last 20 to 30 years, the wet nurse idea has become more and more prevalent. Women hired out to nurse babies um, because the mother, for some reason, for the more affluent, they're working or don't have the time. I'm sure it'd be interesting to see any studies on this, but I'm sure COVID has impacted that practice and the practice of hiring nannies. Um, so, um, so to find a common thread through these prohibitions, while Plutarch doesn't raise the ideas explicitly, is that what really he's warning about is watch the behavior around your children for the sake of language learning. Okay, because what we know today, and this would include even the wet nurse, and it, I think, becomes prominent with the idea of the wet nurse, because who's the wet nurse? It might, she might be a slave, she might be from the lower classes. They may be native speakers, they may not be native speakers. Greek and Roman cities were fairly cosmopolitan, in the Hellenistic and post-Hellenistic and Roman period. Okay, meaning there were foreigners, as the Greeks said, barbarians. Okay, the people from outside of the culture living, and you may be hiring these folks. They don't speak your language, so how are they going to? How does a child learn? Because that is where an infant begins to learn language, is at the breast of a mother. As she or he are being held, as mother speaks to them, as father speaks to them, as the women of the family that want to cuddle speak to them. The men of the family somewhat, but maybe less so. Okay. But also don't speak roughly. We know that verbal abuse, along with physical abuse, obviously, uh, has an impact in language learning. Okay, you don't attain as much language through that process because the vocabularies are stilted. And there are other things. So watch who you're, of course, Plutarch is warning fathers, watch who your teachers are. And a teacher at this time would be called a sophist. One of the more famous sophists. Socrates would have been a sophist, but there's a guy named Isocrates or Isocrates, which was a fairly famous teacher that wrote on pedagogy. And these sophists, not as well as being teachers, what would they really teach? Well, they taught dialectic. Okay, they taught the idea of reasoning through a process, and Plato, famously in Book 7 of his Republic, lays out a curriculum, a course of study, I should say, with the ultimate goal, which looks a lot like the liberal arts without language learning, with the ultimate goal of dialectic, the art of dialectic, the art of thinking well, the art of reasoning well, I should say. Not thinking, reasoning. Because if you reason well, then if you apply that to your life, then you're going to live a better life. We understand that. And for Plato, his the people that achieve dialectic now are available to become philosophers, philosopher kings, if you will. They're philosophers. They think deeply, understand the world, the natural world, the social world, and all the ancients write about this. Okay, so language learning is the key, and that is an important aspect for all teachers today. And so we innately kind of recognize that children often from rough households, or poor households, don't don't have good language skills when they arrive in school and through their early grades, and if they don't, it makes it difficult for them to learn to read, to write, and to do higher level thinking around language, particularly, but also mathematics. Because mathematics is just another form of language. It's more specific, but it's just another form of language. Now, the other part of this, and is very important, is Plutarch talks about what is called the threefold tool of the ancient tool, threefold tool of education. And he talks about this in metaphorically using cultivation and husbandry metaphors, which is interesting. And you could argue that in the ancient world, people understood these metaphors very, very well. Okay, and a threefold tool, based on the Plutarch reading, and I have done much of my research is based upon the threefold tool. So if you're in my 503 class, you are being introduced to that in the Harvey reading. I and my co-author will talk about the threefold tool in the next reading on Peter Ramus and the invention of method, and on the technology article, technological understanding article after that. So the threefold tool is this. The first tool is nature. Now, nature in the ancient sense is different than the sense that we have of nature. We see nature generally as something physiological. Okay, we also see nature as something absent of human involvement. This is not the way the ancient world understood this. Okay, this modern understanding of nature is kind of an aberration in the history of the world. So what is nature? Nature is a combination of physiology, what you're born with, along with early upbringing. Okay, early upbringing. So think of nature as everything a child brings to school when they first start school. This is nature. And you can also think of nature as what children learn outside of the classroom, okay, through experience, okay. And this is important as well, because the way we do school, as opposed to the ancient world, okay, in our graded classrooms with our summers off, with long holidays, right? We kind of expect, as teachers, we would do this. And this is certainly part of my upbringing. Of course, I'm a tad older. Is that I would apply what I learned to one way or the other in the summers. not explicitly, but implied. And as I gained education, my parents would refer back to the things we were supposed to be learning. But I would be using things I learned in school on, if nothing else, coloring, right? The important moral and ethical learning as defined by coloring within the lines, and also understanding the proper color to use in the proper setting. Okay, all these things, because what is color? Color is nothing more than a language. Okay, color language, because color doesn't exist independently of things in the world. So, anyway, so nature. And the next part of the tool is reason, according to Plutarch, in this translation of Plutarch. It's also understood as generally as art. This is the way I learned about it. So art and reason are essentially the same. So so when you see art used within the threefold tool, don't think of fine arts. Don't think of painting or sculpting, right? Of say high literature, music. There would be an art of music, but it's just one of the many arts. Okay, it's not the fine art. Okay, it is the notion of the artificial. So art is our understanding of a subject that is methodized in such a way to present a coherent concept of the subject. So think of the art of history, in the way that historians think, and they present information. That's art. Think of the art of biology in much the same way. How biologists think, how they do things. You could think of an art of science to some degree, but I would, in this day and age, think of the specific scientific subjects. You could think of the art of English much the same way. By the way, we teach English the way the medieval world taught Latin very much. So the ancient world did not see the natural world as useful, right? A tree, it might be nice to sit under, but it's not useful in that sense. So we had to turn wood into something. We had to take lumber, turn it into wood, and then construct something with it. And that's in the Greek, that's referred to as techne, the technical. So the ancient world, medieval world, understood the artificial as being highly beneficial. You'll get a sense of this in the third article that Doug McKnight and I wrote on technology. So, in short, art or reason is everything you learn in school, because what you learn in school is how to reason in the world to live a better life. Use, which is the way the Plutarch treatise is translated, could also be understood as practice, or exercise, could also be understood as habit. So use is applying reason, applying what I learned in school, applying art to my everyday life for the purpose of living a better life. For the purpose of living a better life. The reason we go to school is to live well. Is to live well. Because if I don't live a better life because of school, then why go? Why go? Would be the question. Okay. So I'll be interested to see your glosses on Plutarch. If you hadn't looked at the gloss video, which is about 8 minutes, please do so. And if you have any questions concerning this video, please email me. So any questions, anytime, don't angst, email. So y'all take care. I'll be doing, there'll be some additional videos coming out.